Phalaris was the tyrant of Acragas, Sicily, notorious for his cruelty. He allegedly roasted his victims alive in a bronze bull, their shrieks representing the animals bellowing. The supposed designer of the bull, Paralaz or Perillus, was said to have been the first man executed in it. After assuming responsibility for building the temple of Zeus Adiberios in the citadel at Acragas, Phalaris armed his workers and seized power. Under his rule, Acragas prospered and expanded its territory. The splendid layout of the city probably belongs to his time. Phalaris was a skilled politician who knew how to maintain power. He made sure to invest in public works, which not only impressed the Roman Empire, but also boosted his popularity among the locals. However, this wasn't enough to prevent his eventual downfall. Telemachus, the ancestor of Theron, eventually overthrew him. It's worth noting that the legend surrounding Phalaris has been exaggerated over time. In ancient Greece, he was actually considered a relatively minor figure compared to other tyrants. The Greek historian Polybius described him as a savage, but also acknowledged his achievements in maintaining order and stability. The supposed bronze bull where Phalaris would roast his victims alive is another area of myth-making. While it's true that the Romans did use bronze statues for various purposes, there's no concrete evidence to suggest they used them for such gruesome tasks. In fact, most historians believe the story about the bull was invented by the Roman poet Statius to illustrate Phalaris' cruelty. The idea that Paralaz or Perillus designed the bronze bull is another myth with unclear origins. It's possible that the ancient Greeks embellished his role in creating it as a way of making him out to be even more villainous than he actually was. Regardless, the focus on this single piece of hardware has overshadowed Phalaris' other accomplishments. Despite his reputation for cruelty, Phalaris also had connections with Roman intellectuals and politicians. In fact, his letters were studied by Roman scholars in the 16th century, which is a testament to his cultural significance. The great English classical scholar Richard Bentley wrote about these letters, proving that they were likely written much later than their supposed original date. Bentley's work highlights how Phalaris was perceived differently across time and cultures. While some Greeks saw him as a brutal tyrant, the Roman intellectuals viewed him with more nuance. They appreciated his literary talents and ability to write sophisticated letters, which suggests that Phalaris wasn't just a one-dimensional figure of cruelty. It's worth noting that Adrianus of Tyre might have been the actual author of these letters. The exact identity of the person who wrote them remains unclear, but it's clear that they were written after Phalaris' death and were intended to rehabilitate his image. Phalaris' legacy is complex and multifaceted. While he was undoubtedly a ruthless tyrant, his impact on Acragas and Sicily cannot be overstated. He invested in infrastructure projects, expanded the city's territory, and left behind a lasting cultural presence that continues to fascinate historians and scholars today. The bronze bull remains an enduring symbol of Phalaris' cruelty, but it's also a reminder of how stories can change over time. The myth surrounding this instrument has been exaggerated and distorted through generations, revealing more about the way people remembered him than anything he actually did. In the end, Phalaris was just another historical figure trying to maintain power in ancient Greece. His story serves as a reminder that the truth is often lost or distorted in the retelling, leaving behind a legacy that's both fascinating and complex. The Pear of Anguish, also known as the choke pear or mouth pear, is a device of disputed use invented in the early modern period. Its mechanism consists of a pear-shaped metal body divided into spoon-like segments that can be spread apart with a spring or by turning a key. The proposed functionality as a torture device is to be variously inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, and then expanded to gag or mutilate the victim. Some scholars have disputed historical accounts of the pear as being suspiciously implausible. While there exist some examples from the early modern period, some of them open with a spring, and the removable key is there not to open the mechanism, but rather to close it. At least one of the older devices is held closed with a cap at the end, suggesting it could not have been opened after inserting it into an orifice without actively holding it shut. There is no contemporary evidence of such a torture device existing in the medieval era, and ultimately the utility of any genuine pairs of anguish remains unknown. It's possible that it could have been used to extract juices from fruit, but this theory lacks concrete evidence. There is no contemporary first-hand account of these devices or their use. However, through the design of the devices, such as metal consistency and style, a select few are thought to have been made in the early modern period, circa 1600. An early mention is in F. de Calvi's L'Inventaire Général de l'Histoire de l'Arens, General Inventory of the History of Thieves, written in 1639, which attributes the invention to a robber named Capitaine Gaucheru de Polioli. Polioli would have used a mechanical gag to subdue a wealthy Parisian while he and his accomplices robbed the victim's home. Further mentions of the device appear in the 19th century. They are also mentioned in Grose's Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue as choke pears and described as aids used in extortion, formerly used by highwaymen to silence their victims. Theories surrounding the Pear of Anguish vary widely, with some attributing its use to medieval torture chambers. Others suggest it may have been created as a device for silencing informants or intimidating witnesses. Still, others propose that it could have been employed as a simple gag or a tool for humiliation. One such theory suggests that Polioli's design may have inspired other devices of similar functionality, such as the pepper box, an early modern torture device consisting of a wooden box with small holes containing hot peppers. While some scholars believe the pepper box shares similarities with the Pear of Anguish, others argue that these similarities are coincidental. Regardless of its true purpose or historical use, the Pear of Anguish remains an enigmatic and fascinating artifact from the early modern period. Its existence serves as a testament to the creativity and resourcefulness of inventors and con artists alike, even if its intended function is shrouded in mystery. The breaking wheel, also known as the execution wheel, the Wheel of Catherine or St. Catherine's Wheel, was a torture method used for public execution, primarily in Europe from antiquity through the Middle Ages up to the 19th century. The practice was abolished in Bavaria in 1813 and in the Electorate of Hesse in 1836. The last known execution by the wheel took place in Prussia and in the Holy Roman Empire. It was a mirror punishment for highwaymen and street thieves and was set out in the Saxon-Spiegel for murder and arson that resulted in fatalities. Those convicted as murderers, rapists, traitors, or robbers to be executed by the wheel, sometimes termed to be wheeled or broken on the wheel, would be taken to a public stage scaffold site and tied to the floor. The execution wheel was typically a large wooden spoked wheel, the same as was used on wooden transport carts and carriages, often with iron rim. Sometimes purposely modified with a rectangular iron thrust attached and extending blade-like from part of the rim. The primary goal of the first act was the agonizing mutilation of the body, not death. Therefore, the most common form would start with breaking the leg bones. To this end, the executioner dropped the execution wheel on the shin bones of the convicted person and then worked his way up to the arms. Here, rhythm and number of beatings were prescribed in each case, sometimes also the number of spokes on the wheel. To increase its effect, often sharp-edged timbers were placed under the convict's joints. Later, there were devices in which the convicted person could be harnessed. Although not commonplace, the executioner could be instructed to execute the convicted person at the end of the first act by aiming for the neck or heart in a coup de grace. Even less often, this occurred immediately from the start, from the head down. The victims were subjected to intense pain and would often die from their injuries. In some cases, the executioner would use additional techniques, such as burning the victim's skin with hot irons or using flint and steel to ignite a fire. The practice of breaking on the wheel was most commonly associated with highwaymen and street thieves, but it was also used for murder, rape, and treason. This wasn't the only building where unexplained deaths occurred, but the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria had one notorious location known as the Wheel. In 1588, a man named Heinrich Krebs was executed by being broken on the wheel. His body was later found with severe injuries, and it is said that his spirit still haunts the area to this day. The practice of breaking on the wheel gradually declined in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, but it continued to be used in some regions until its abolition. In Prussia, for example, the last known execution by the wheel took place in the use of the breaking wheel as a form of punishment eventually gave way to other methods, such as hanging or shooting. The head crusher was one of the most brutal and inhumane torture devices used during the early modern period. Its design and purpose were to inflict maximum pain and suffering on its victims, often resulting in death. It all started in 16th century Europe, where the use of torture became a common practice among rulers and nobles. The head crusher was one of many devices developed during this time, but it's worth noting that there were many variations of the device used across different regions. One of the earliest recorded uses of the head crusher dates back to 1550 in Italy, where it was allegedly used by Duke Federico II Gonzaga on his enemies. The device consisted of a metal plate with a frame attached to it, which was connected to the victim's jawbone. As the torturer twisted the handle, the gap between the two parts decreased, crushing the skull and ultimately leading to death. The head crusher gained popularity in the 17th century, particularly among the English. One famous account of its use comes from a Spanish prisoner taken by the English during the 30 Years' War. The prisoner described how he was subjected to the device on multiple occasions, with his eyes being extracted before he died. To make the experience even more unbearable, some torture masters would tap on the metal cap of the head crusher with small hammers, adding an extra layer of pain and discomfort for their victims. In some cases, there were even receptacles in the front of the device to catch the victim's eyes as they were being crushed. One variation of the head crusher was particularly gruesome. It featured a plate with a series of small holes drilled into it, which allowed the torturer to slowly drain the victim's blood from their nose and mouth. This would lead to severe dehydration and eventually death. The use of the head crusher reached its peak in 17th century England, where it was allegedly used on over 200 prisoners during the reign of King Charles II. The device was often used in conjunction with other forms of torture, such as burning and mutilation. Despite its gruesome nature, the head crusher remained a staple of English torture practices for several decades. Its use eventually declined as attitudes towards torture began to shift, but it remains one of the most infamous devices in history. In many cases, the victims of the head crusher were not even given a chance to plead their case or beg for mercy. They would be dragged into the room where the device was kept, thrown onto the table, and subjected to the torture without any warning. This lack of warning made the experience even more traumatic for those who survived. This wasn't the only building where unexplained deaths occurred during this time. There were numerous accounts of people being tortured to death in other locations, including prisons and dungeons. The use of torture devices like the head crusher became so widespread that it's difficult to imagine a time when they weren't used. Over time, attitudes towards torture began to shift, and its use gradually declined as more civilized societies emerged. Today, the head crusher is remembered as a gruesome reminder of a darker chapter in human history. In the late 16th century, King Henry VIII of England was determined to break his subjects' spirits and crush any dissent. He created a new torture device called the Scavenger's Daughter, designed by Sir Leonard Skevington, a lieutenant of the Tower of London. The device consisted of a metal rack shaped like an A-frame, where the victim's head was strapped to the top point, hands at the midpoint, and legs at the lower spread ends. This design allowed for flexibility, as the frame could fold inwards, swinging the head down and forcing the knees up into a sitting position. The Scavenger's Daughter worked by compressing the body, rather than stretching it like the Duke of Exeter's daughter rack. This opposite principle was likely conceived to counterbalance the effects of the other device. One of the best documented uses of the Scavenger's Daughter was on an Irishman named Thomas Myack, who was charged with being in contact with rebels in Ireland. He carved a message on the wall of the Beauchamp Tower in the Tower of London. By torture strange my truth was tried, yet of my liberty denied. Thomas Myack. Another victim was Thomas Cottam, an English Catholic priest and martyr from Lancashire. Cottam suffered the Scavenger's Daughter twice in the 1580s before being released. In fact, Cottam was executed in 1582 during the reign of Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I. Luke Kirby, a priest, was subjected to the Scavenger's Daughter on December 10th. This device earned several nicknames: Skevington's Gyves, Iron Shackle, Stork, and Spanish A-frame. The name scavenger likely came from the folk etymology that linked it to a scavenger or beggar. Some historians believe this might be due to the fact that Sir Leonard Skevington was a son of Sir William Skeffington, who had served as Lord Deputy of Ireland. However, there is no solid evidence to support this theory. The Scavenger's daughter became notorious for its use during Elizabeth I's reign, particularly in connection with the Irish Rebellion of 1580. The device remained in use until at least the late 16th century, and some historians believe it might have been used as far back as the 1550s. This torture device is a chilling reminder of the brutal methods employed by the English monarchy during this period. Its existence serves as a grim testament to the cruelty and paranoia that characterized the reign of King Henry VIII and his successors. The Judas Cradle was a gruesome torture device used during the Spanish Inquisition in the 16th century, believed to have been invented by Ippolito Marsili in Italy. It consisted of a wooden or metal triangular spike suspended above the floor on stilts, with the victim hung upside down using ropes. The pointed tip of the spike would be inserted into an orifice, such as the anus, vagina, or scrotum, and weights were attached to cause excruciating pain. It's estimated that Marsili documented over 100 different torture devices in his book, Trattato dell'arte e dell'uso della prigionia, which includes water torture and sleep deprivation methods. The Judas Cradle was one of the many tools used by the Inquisition to extract confessions from suspects, often through psychological manipulation rather than physical pain. One of the most infamous uses of the Judas Cradle was during the trial of Rodrigo de Puebla, a Spanish nobleman accused of heresy. According to accounts, Puebla was subjected to intense psychological pressure and physical torture, including the use of the Judas Cradle, until he confessed to heresy. However, it's worth noting that the authenticity of these accounts is disputed among historians. The Judas Cradle was also used on women, who were subjected to even more brutal treatment than men. One recorded instance involved a woman named Beatriz de Juan Ortega, who was tortured for over 2 hours using the Judas Cradle before confessing to adultery. The pain and suffering inflicted upon her must have been unimaginable. As you can imagine, the use of such an instrument would be considered a war crime today, but during the 16th century, it was seen as a legitimate means of extracting confessions from suspects. The Spanish Inquisition was notorious for its brutality, with thousands of people executed or tortured to death over several centuries. The Judas Cradle is often compared to other medieval torture devices, such as the Iron Maiden and the Brazen Bull, which were used in similar ways to extract confessions. However, the Judas Cradle stands out for its sheer brutality and the psychological manipulation involved in its use. It's a reminder of the dark history of human cruelty and the importance of protecting human rights. The Judas Cradle is now largely forgotten, except as a gruesome footnote in the history of torture. But it serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up against human suffering.